On May 3rd, 1874, the noon temperature in Prairie Rose, Kansas, stood at 86 degrees in the shade of the telegraph office, and wind from the southwest drove a dry grit along Main Street that hissed against door sills and wagon spokes. Prairie Rose held 312 souls that spring, a rail-stop settlement raised on one run of wheat luck and one general store credit ledger, with false front buildings facing a road so wide it looked less like planning than optimism. Men spoke of expansion, of new siding, of additional fencing for autumn stock. Women traded seed and cloth patterns on church steps. Children ran races between stacked grain sacks behind Abel Kincaid's store. At the edge of that small confidence, behind a weathered barn on the Thornton lot, one man worked a mason line across disturbed earth as if he trusted measurements more than weather and more than talk. Ray Thornton set the transit level on a tripod he had repaired twice and sighted along a 12-foot mark staked with ash pegs. His left hand, flattened years earlier under splintered timber and iron bolts, could no longer close completely. He held the level staff with the right and braced the left against the instrument in a practice clamp that wasted no motion. There had been a time when Prairie Rose hired him for bridge spans, culvert framing, and difficult roof pitches because he could read a slope by eye and prove it with arithmetic. That time ended when prosperity found easier men to admire, and caution began to look like fear. Ray had not come west as a farmer. He came with the Union Pacific grading crews, first as a timber hand, then as a bridge wright trusted with temporary trestles where trains moved before permanence arrived. In late October of 1869, near Cheyenne, a support beam twisted under premature load, and the collapse that followed killed 2 laborers and broke the architecture of Ray's working life in a single hour. The left hand survived, though 3 fingers healed stiff and narrow as carved wood. The foreman paid him out. The company replaced him, and the frontier proceeded without ceremony. He drifted south in hired wagons and freight teams, taking rough carpentry when available, then stonework when he understood that stone asked for patience rather than speed. By 1872, he had purchased for $68 and a wagon axle repair, a narrow lot at the back of Prairie Rose where ground fell gently toward a seasonal drainage swale and nobody wanted to build. Knowledge arrived to him first through pain and then through memory. His mother, Lila Thornton, had been born in Tennessee Hill Country where summer rot could ruin winter plans faster than any thief. She taught by demonstration rather than lecture. Salt thickness measured by fingertip depth, barrel staves checked by ear, ash and lime used where insects gathered, potatoes banked in straw and earth to hold through thaw and freeze. She had buried crocks beneath smokehouse floors in July heat and opened them in January with food still sound. When fever took her in 1864, Ray was old enough to remember her hands and her rules, and young enough to believe he would never need them in such full measure. The plains corrected that belief. Each year he watched Prairie Rose place its confidence above ground, where weather, pests, and transport delays could reach it first. He spoke little about this inheritance because it did not sound modern beside railroad schedules and merchant credit, yet he kept notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, with entries copied from memory and from his own trials. Brine ratios by pound, spoilage rates by month, cellar humidity judged by chalk line fading, heat retention in packed earth against stone. His script was square and deliberate, each numeral legible even in lantern light. In February 1873, he made his first calculation for a buried provision vault, sized not for one family winter but for one full agricultural failure plus overrun, assuming delayed rail resupply and elevated prices and scarcity. He recalculated 6 times. The final plan fit beneath his barn because timber above concealed activity below, because animals generated slight heat, and because theft declined when neighbors believed there was nothing worth stealing under manure and tack. The project did not begin with digging. It began with inventory and money. Ray sold his spare team harness, a brass surveying compass from bridge days, and 2 finished walnut chests he had built for the Hollister sisters. Then he took 6 weeks of paid masonry work at a schoolhouse foundation near Flint River. Over 14 months, he assembled $418, spending in stages that matched material delivery and labor strain. Limestone block from a quarry east of Cottonwood Creek cost $92, delivered by dray. Lime putty ingredients, including quicklime and screen sand, cost $21.30. Oak barrel staves from Wichita suppliers, bought through an intermediate hauler because Kincaid would not extend favorable terms, consumed $84. Iron strap hinges for trapdoor framing, 2 cast latches, wire mesh, tar, candles, ledger books, salt by the sack, and pork contracts filled the rest. By mid-March 1873, he had marked a rectangle 12 by 18 feet beneath the rear half of his barn floor, leaving a 3-foot service walkway on the east side and preserving support posts with temporary cribbing. He dug to a depth of 9 feet 2 inches, cutting side walls and step benches to prevent collapse during spring damp, then laid a 6-inch gravel bed for drainage and set limestone courses with lime mortar and joints, packed tight enough to resist rat intrusion. The ceiling would not be true ceiling, but heavy joist decking under barn planks, insulated with packed clay and straw, then coated in lime wash to discourage mold. 2 vent shafts rose in opposite corners, each fitted with mesh screens and shutter baffles, angled to limit direct wind while allowing slow air exchange. He tested draft with tallow smoke and adjusted baffle slats until movement held steady. Prairie Rose observed all of this in fragments. A wagon of stone here, a barrel delivery there, a laborer hired for 1 afternoon to hoist joists and never invited back. Curiosity became commentary, and commentary hardened into ridicule once Abel Kincaid named the whole. Kincaid was a man of polished boots, broad watch chain, and cuffs that remained white even in harvest dust, built thick through chest and confidence from years of controlling flour, lamp oil, nails, and gossip through one counter. He stood on his store steps one Saturday, watched Ray unload salt sacks, and announced to the feed line that Thornton was digging himself a burrow against imaginary famine. "Thornton's mole hole," he said, loud enough for teamsters at the trough and women at the cloth barrel. "If fear could be sold by the yard, he would be our wealthiest man." Laughter moved through the crowd, repeated at church railings, copied by boys who liked anything that sounded cruel and clever at once. Ray did not answer Kincaid in public. He measured. He carried. He whitewashed limestone until the vault walls reflected lantern flame with a dull milk glow. By July, he began provisioning in earnest. Hard red wheat dried to safe storage moisture and packed into tar-sealed barrels. Cornmeal double-sacked in waxed cloth before barreling. Beans sorted by hand to remove cracked seed. Smoked pork rubbed with coarse salt, brown sugar, and black pepper, then layered in oak casks with fresh salt between courses. He recorded weights at loading and expected loss by month. The pork alone reached 900 pounds by early autumn, not from one purchase but from 3 hog contracts timed to curing weather. He built straw-packed pits for potatoes just north of the barn foundation, each pit 4 feet deep, lined with split rails and screened at top vents to deter rodents. He tracked temperatures morning and evening with a spirit thermometer hung midway down the vault stair. In July, heat that rose to 101 degrees above ground, the vault held between 52 and 56. On 2 afternoons above 100, it held at 54. He wrote each number without flourish. The work gave him no social reward and no reduction in mockery. Boys painted Mole Man on his gate in lampblack and ran when he approached. Two haulers refused his small freight after Kincaid suggested, in that soft voice merchants used when debt stood nearby, that respectable business did not encourage hoarding panic. Ray replaced them with an older teamster from outside town and paid cash. One evening, as sun dropped and barn swallows cut low arcs above the lot, a hired hand named Caleb Dunn set down a crate of jars and said that no seller was worth such public contempt. Ray rested both hands on the crate, the damaged one and the sound one together, and gave the only answer Prairie Rose would later quote with accuracy. "Let them talk. Mockery has never filled a winter bowl." Then he lifted the crate and carried it down the trap steps into the cool, chalk-bright room he was building beneath the floor, where silence and stone kept better faith than applause. The crate held 24-quart jars, each filled with rendered lard above a lower layer of confit pork, and Ray placed them on the second limestone shelf beside two ledger books, then stood still long enough to listen to the vault itself. The faint pull of air through screened vents, the soft creak of barn beams above, the steadiness that came only from earth wrapped around stone. He marked the shelf edge with charcoal, row and count, and closed the book on a figure that had begun as private arithmetic and was becoming obligation. When he climbed back into evening light, the lamp black on his gate had not faded. Mole Man remained dark against weathered pine. He fetched a bucket, scrubbed half of it away, left the rest, and returned to work before full dark. By the second week of June, heat settled over Prairie Rose without relief, and creek margins showed pale bands where spring water had already withdrawn. Ray moved through each day by list and measure. Salt inspection at dawn, smokehouse check at mid-morning, vent shutters at noon, barrels seam tapped by lantern after supper. He tapped each cask with a hickory stick and listened for hollow variants that suggested shrinkage. He reset 3 hoops and brushed warm tar over one seam where a bead of brine had surfaced. In his notebook, he recorded moisture readings by touch standard, learned from his mother, then cross-marked them against weight loss on the spring scale. He had no apprentice. He carried his own numbers. On the 21st of June, 1874, when telegraph heat reached 94 degrees and horseflies stood thick around the livery trough, he took a glass preserving jar into town with the lid wired down and a square of cloth wrapped around his palm. Inside lay locust eggs scraped from the creek bank in a packed gray cluster dense as sifted ash. Ray set the jar on Abel Kincaid's counter between a coffee sack and a bolt of calico and asked that Kincaid call the council before sundown. Kincaid did call them, though not in the spirit requested, and by late afternoon 9 men gathered in the rear room of the store, shirt sleeves rolled, collars open, each one annoyed at being pulled from harvest estimates. Ray spoke plainly and in sequence. He named what he had seen at 4 creek bends and 2 fence lines, egg beds in unusual concentration, meadow larks abandoning low fields before noon, and dispatch riders out of Newton carrying reports of sky-thick swarms that stripped gardens and grain in neighboring counties within hours. He proposed 3 immediate steps with figures attached. First, seed grain rationing under written allotment until autumn. Second, suspension of whiskey imports and non-essential freight so wagon capacity could be reserved for flour, salt, and dried beans. Third, communal drying racks at the churchyard, built from rough pine and wire mesh to preserve any produce still standing before the hatch matured. He placed his own labor first in each line and offered timber already cut. Kincaid laughed before any other man answered, a short bark that gave permission for lesser laughter, then lifted the jar, turned it toward the window and said, these were field nuisances inflated by a man who had mistaken a barn cellar for governance. He called Ray's report insect gossip and insisted the railroad would deliver what was needed, as it always had, if needed at all. By closing bell, flour that had sold at $4.10 per hundredweight stood repriced at $6, and two clerks were told to use the new chalk figure on every sack. That evening, on church steps, Kincaid repeated that fear hoarding was unneighborly, and several voices echoed him with the confidence of souls who still had full bins and green gardens. Ray did not return to argue. He returned to the vault and doubled task cadence. In the final 10 days of June, he salted another 180 pounds of pork, increasing brine concentration by 1 ounce per gallon against rising ambient heat. He lined new potato pits with straw cut from late spring wheat, 4 inches at base and 6 at sidewalls, then capped each pit with plank and packed earth to a measured thickness of 14 inches. He hung additional mesh screens over both barn vents and added inward baffles so dust storms would not choke airflow. On July 3rd, with the outside thermometer at 101, the vault held 53 by noon and 54 by sunset. He wrote both numbers and underlined neither. Kincaid shifted from mockery to pressure. He canceled Ray's store credit entirely, citing poor standing and antisocial stockpiling, then persuaded 2 regular haulers to refuse small contracted deliveries to the Thornton lot. One returned Ray's deposit in coin and apology. The other sent word only. Ray hired Elias Morrow, a widower teamster from 6 miles north, for cash carriage at $1.20 per load mile, a dear price that still proved cheaper than dependence. He purchased seed tins in Wichita through Morrow's route, waxed each seam himself, and stored hard red wheat reserved strictly for planting. The ledger split into 3 columns after that: consumption, emergency ration, and spring seed not to be touched except by common vote. Sunday brought sharper cruelty because it wore formal clothes. At gathering, after hymns and notices, Kincaid stood near the side aisle and remarked loudly that some men had buried enough food to feed armies while their neighbors bought by the week. No name was needed. Boys heard and carried the line outward, and by dusk new lamp-black letters appeared under the old insult on Ray's gate: dig deep, fear deeper. Ray washed the paint in silence at the pump, while a small figure waited by the fence with 2 chipped jars cradled in both arms. Nettie Wainwright, 12 years old and solemn beyond her years, asked whether he still wanted glass brought from the smoke shed. He said yes, weighed each jar for cracks, and thanked her as if she were a paid hand. She returned the next evening and the next. 3 days passed before the first confirmed county report arrived by Ryder from the South Line. Then another came from the West. Fields were being tested in segments, not yet ruined but marked. Ray asked no council favor after that. He posted a chalkboard inside his barn with quantities and dates, visible to any soul who came through the open door. Pork weight, bean count, meal barrels, seed tins, lamp oil, soap, and wood cordage. Transparency was his answer to accusations he did not bother to refute. Nettie copied the numbers into a second book with schoolroom penmanship, and Ray checked her columns each night at the stairhead. When she made one arithmetic error, she corrected it before he spoke. By late July, she could tally by lantern without pausing. The town above ground looked prosperous through August. Porch paint gleamed. New hats arrived from Topeka. A fiddler played outside the hotel on Saturdays while teamsters swapped wagers about autumn yields. Yet the fields carried a brittle stillness that experienced farmers did not name aloud, and each southwest wind brought a dry clicking across fences and clapboard walls, as if light rain had turned to hard shells in the air. Ray walked perimeter rows at dawn and found fresh hatch in patchwork bands near the creek. He carried samples in folded paper to 3 farms and left each packet on a kitchen table with one instruction: burn stubble lines now, not later. 2 farms acted. 1 did not. On August 29th, dispatch from Newton reached Prairie Rose by telegraph and by rumor within the same hour. The wording was clipped and plain. Dense flights observed. Direction northeast. Crop loss severe and exposed tracks. Advise immediate protection of stores and livestock tack. Kincaid read the message twice in his store doorway, then told the small crowd that scattered flights were expected this time of year, and no panic was warranted. He did, however, raise salt and lamp oil again by nightfall. Shelves that had looked abundant in June began to show gaps where staples had stood. Families with cash bought fast. Families without cash bought little. The difference settled on the town like extra dust. On September 1st, heat climbed to 98 and held into evening. Ray moved barrels from outer rows to central stack, tightened trap hinges, and had Nettie carry ledger copies to the church strongbox in case of fire. He measured ration potential one more time, not for one household now, but against the settlement count, adjusted for infants and infirm. The final line at midnight read like hard law. At strict issue, primary stores could sustain 120 souls for 140 days, or 200 souls for 81 days, excluding seed reserve. He set down the pencil, folded the sheet, and placed it in the inner ledger pocket. Above him, barn boards ticked in the cooling air. Beyond the lot, dogs barked and then fell quiet. At noon on September 2nd, 1874, the southwestern horizon darkened in a straight band that did not resemble storm cloud, smoke, or dust. Within minutes, the band lifted, thickened, and resolved into movement, wing over wing, quarter-mile depth by later estimate, a living front that crossed 15 miles of country and descended on prairie rows with the sound of dry hail on tin roofs. Men ran into fields with blankets and branches beating at the air. Women covered garden rows with sheets that vanished beneath weight and chewing. Children shouted and were pulled indoors. In less than 6 hours, wheat heads were gone, bean vines reduced to threads, orchard bark stripped in ragged rings, and saddle leather scored where harness hung exposed. The swarm settled, rose, settled again, and by dusk left stalks, standing like broom straw, across farms that had held promise at breakfast. Ray stood at his fence until the worst had passed, coat collar buttoned against the constant strike of wings, and watched Nettie Wainwright in her yard, swinging a broom over her mother's wash line, small arms laboring against a force no child could command. He crossed, took the broom, and sent her to fetch cloth sacks from his barn, while he shook garments clear and tied them into bundles. When he looked toward Main Street, he saw Abel Kincaid boarding his store windows from the inside. Hammer blows hurried and uneven, while 2 clerks carried flour sacks out the rear to a locked room already half empty after 1 week of fear buying. Authority had not been argued away. It had been eaten in broad daylight. That night, Ray opened the trapdoor fully, lowered 2 lanterns into the vault, and brought out the ration ledger, Nettie beside him with ink and straightedge. He counted each shelf aloud, then converted weight to issue by soul and by day, adding a column for labor capacity and sickness allowances. Private preparation ended there. Public duty began. At dawn, before church bell, Abel Kincaid came up the Thornton path without watch chain, without polished boots, hat in both hands, and asked for enough salt pork to keep 20 children alive through the first hard freeze. Ray did not answer at once. He took Kincaid into the barn, set the hat on a feed chest, and opened the ledger on a clean page while Nettie Wainwright stood at the stair rail with ink on her fingers and a ruler in her apron pocket. Then he stated terms in a carpenter's cadence, each point square and load-bearing. No household would receive private preference. Rations would be issued by account of souls, age adjusted only for infants and the bedridden. Seed wheat sealed in wax tins would remain sealed unless a council vote was witnessed and recorded. Any soul too weak to cut fuel would be assigned mending, hauling water, or tending the soup fire when it came time. Kincaid listened with his shoulders drawn inward, not arguing, not looking up. When Ray finished, he slid the ledger across the barrel top and pointed to the line for witness signature. Kincaid signed Abel Kincaid in a hand that shook only once on the final stroke. Ray and Nettie began immediate conversion of stores to issue units, while Kincaid carried word through Main Street that the first ration line would open at the churchyard by sundown. The process was not generous in appearance, but it was merciful in arithmetic. Pork casks were opened, top salt brushed off and reclaimed. Then cuts were weighed in quarter-pound allotments on a hanging scale calibrated with iron counterweights Ray had cast years earlier for bridge work. Beans were measured by dry cup and entered as 1 pound per 3 souls per day when paired with meal. Cornmeal was reduced to a 6-ounce issue after Ray recalculated projected rail delay against county telegrams. By late afternoon, he had drawn a 4-column table in block script: household name, soul count, issue weight, labor assignment. Nettie copied each line to a duplicate sheet for church records, so no one man could alter numbers in darkness and claim forgetfulness in daylight. The first line formed under a sky still carrying stray locust drift, thin now but relentless, the insects ticking against clapboard, as if the season had become a clock made of hunger. Prairie Rose had once gathered in that yard for hymn singing and harvest meals. Now there were no baskets, only sacks and tins held close against aprons and coat fronts. Kincaid stood at the line head and called names in the same voice he had once used for account collection. Yet the authority had changed hands without ceremony. He called who Ray marked. He repeated what Ray said. Some souls accepted the measure with silent gratitude. Some protested, accustomed to choosing from shelves and paying for comfort. Ray answered each protest with the ledger open, figures visible, no raised volume, no apology for restraint. This amount keeps your house through 7 days if boiled with water and root peel, he told one rancher who demanded double for hired men. Double now will leave your neighbors short in November. We are no longer buying appetite. We are buying time. By the 3rd day after the swarm, Ray had moved from emergency distribution to infrastructure because he understood that 1 week of orderly issue could still collapse into winter ruin if fuel, sanitation, and preservation were left to chance. He marked teams for trenching shallow earth cellars near homes whose kitchens sat on exposed lots. Each trench, 6 feet by 8 and 4 feet deep where soil allowed, lined with scavenged plank and straw to buffer cold swings. He had Kincaid unlock the store's remaining wire stock and nails, then entered every foot and pound against future repayment to the cooperative he intended to force into being. Nettie and 2 widows, Eliza Dobson and Ruth Morrow, ran jar sterilization in iron kettles behind the church, dipping lids in near-boiling water and setting them inverted on lime-washed boards. Children carried only kindling and clean cloth, tasks suited to small hands and steady feet. Never to the night patrols Ray assigned to men with lanterns and clubs for driving rodents from grain rows. Work continued at the Thornton barn as if the disaster had merely changed the customer, not the craft. Ray widened the trap opening by 9 inches to pass barrels without binding on the stair turn. He reinforced the north joist with a second timber bolted through with carriage pins so 6 men could stand above while 2 unloaded below. He mixed fresh lime wash in a ratio his mother had taught him by eye and hand. 1 part slaked lime to 3 parts water with a handful of salt for adhesion, then brushed every vault wall from floorstone to joist underside to cut mold bloom before cold weather trapped damp. The vault's temperature held between 51 and 55, while days above ground still touched the 90s, and Ray posted those readings on a slate board near the church door, so doubters could see that buried stone offered fact where rumor offered only appetite. Souls came to stare at the numbers as if they were scripture. Mockery did not vanish when hunger arrived. It changed shape, lost laughter, and put on the language of grievance. A group of ranch hands who had painted Mole Man on Ray's gate in summer now muttered that the mole hole had become a throne, that one injured carpenter meant to count spoonfuls like a jailer. One woman whose husband had speculated on wheat futures said Ray had brought scarcity by speaking it aloud, as if warning and cause were the same thing when pride needed shelter. At the Saturday gathering, with shelves in Kincaid's store, already thin enough to show bare plank behind canned peaches, old accusations returned in new coats. Hoarder, alarmist, man who mistrusted Providence. Ray did not answer from the steps. He answered by posting full inventories each morning and subtracting each day's issue where every soul could read the dissent in chalk. Transparency eroded slander more efficiently than argument. The line shortened. The muttering quieted, though it did not disappear. Kincaid bore his own reduction in public, and the town watched because they had measured their confidence through his prosperity for years. His white cuffs were gone, replaced by rolled sleeves stained with salt and soot. The watch chain remained for a week, then disappeared beneath his vest when he signed over his spare freight wagon and 2 bay draft mules in Cottonwood Creek for 2 wagon loads of limestone rubble and 6 sacks of quicklime, materials Ray had listed as necessary for community vault construction before first frost. Kincaid oversaw delivery himself, unloading stone in front of men who had once followed his jokes like campfire sparks. At dusk he came to the barn with palms blistered and asked how to set the first course so walls would not heave and freeze. Ray handed him a plumb line and showed him how to seat each stone broad face down, joints staggered, mortar packed with a trowel edge until no daylight showed through. The lesson lasted 1 hour. No audience applauded. The warning signs for the next phase came almost immediately, because locust ruin alone did not define frontier hunger. Transport failure and weather completed it. Telegraph notice from Newton on September 18th reported rail congestion and diverted grain cars, with priority given to military contracts farther west. 2 days later, a freight captain out of Emporia told Kincaid that wagon teams were refusing long runs through stripped counties where forage had been eaten to stubble and horse feed cost more than flour. Ray heard both reports, entered both in the ledger margin, and cut weekly ration by another ounce of meal per adult soul. Protest rose again. He held the line. At dawn, he walked creek banks and found late-season egg bands already laid in new seams of damp earth, a sign that spring would not bring easy relief even if winter passed without catastrophe. He collected samples in paper twists and nailed them to a church board beside his handwritten note. Burn margins after first thaw. Do not wait for certainty. Animal behavior confirmed what dispatches suggested. Meadowlarks that should have lingered in field edges lifted in groups before noon and tracked south in a single week. Barn cats prowled granaries in daylight, driven by rodent movement from ruined pasture to stored feed. Jackrabbits came into town gardens despite shouting and thrown stones, stripping what late greens remained. Ray translated each sign into practice, never into panic. He ordered all exposed grain sacks raised 6 inches on slatted platforms to reduce damp uptake. He required ash rings around potato pits and repaired vent mesh twice where gnawing had begun. He had Nettie mark each household's fuel stack in cord fractions on a township map, and assigned crews to cut cottonwood along the creek before first freeze made hauling treacherous. Some men mocked the map as schoolroom play. Those same men borrowed axes from the workshed by week's end. By early October, the false calm that follows first disaster settled over Prairie Rose with a deceptive softness. Days were mild. Sunlight lay warm on porch rails. A stranger passing through might have mistaken the town for stable, because smoke rose from chimneys and church bells still rang on Sunday. Yet beneath that surface, the arithmetic tightened each night. Ray's inventory showed beans down to 247 pounds, meal at 11 barrels and change, pork reduced by 1/3 from initial count, seed reserve untouched only because he guarded it like law. Kincaid submitted his store ledger for cross-check and admitted in front of 2 councilmen and the widows at the table that he had sold summer flour at inflated prices when warning came. Ray did not rebuke him. He converted remaining store stock into ration units and entered the totals under communal custody. On October 14th, wind shifted north and brought the first hard warning in temperature rather than rumor. Morning opened at 31 degrees, with water skinning over in horse troughs before sunrise and a brittle rim on wash basins by kitchen doors. Ray moved soup kettles from planning to operation that day. 3 iron pots set over brick trenches in the churchyard, each marked for specific households, so no line crushed inward at noon. Nettie rang a handbell for first issue, her coat too large, ledger held flat against the wind. Kincaid carried split wood from the church shed and fed the trench fires in measured turns, no longer owner and supplicant, but laborer among laborers. The town watched this arrangement with mixed shame and relief, because it revealed what they had refused all summer. Survival required both preparation and submission to shared limits, and pride had no caloric value. Even then, some souls clung to old contempt as if it were a blanket. One ranch widow told Eliza Dobson that she would sooner starve than eat from a mole's pantry. Eliza, who had spent 3 nights sterilizing jars until her wrists swelled, answered without heat that starvation would not prove character, only arithmetic. The widow came to the line the next morning with a pail and no further speech. Ray saw her, marked her household, and issued the same portion as any other, because discipline without impartiality curdles into vendetta, and he had built the vault to prevent ruin, not to rank worthiness. At sunset, he returned to his barn, checked vent shutters, and wrote the day's figures by lamplight, while the first sustained cold settled over Prairie Rose like a hand that did not intend to lift soon. By dawn, the hand had tightened. On October the 15th, 1874, the thermometer outside the telegraph office read 24 degrees, and a skim of ice sealed every trough on Main Street thick enough to bear a coin. Ray moved from house to house before first bell, checking chimney drafts and stove clearances in cabins he had marked as fuel-poor on Nettie's map. Then returned to the churchyard to reset kettle schedules for longer boil time in colder air. Wind turned northeast by noon and stayed there for 6 days, driving powdery dust over frozen ground and stripping what little standing fodder remained in the outlots where ranch hands had hoped to winter stock. No one in Prairie Rose called it a storm yet. It was only a warning. The warning was sufficient. 3 days later, a telegram from Newton reached the Prairie Rose office at 4:10 in the afternoon, wire faint and broken twice before completion. Grain cars had been delayed at 2 junctions. Priority had shifted again. Estimated resupply, once measured in days, was now uncertain beyond 3 weeks. Kincaid carried the slip to Ray without preface and held it under the barn lantern, while Nettie copied every line into the communal ledger. Ray cut rations that night by another ounce of meal per adult soul and 1/2 ounce of beans for households with no labor contribution logged. The protest at first issue the next morning was louder than any before, not because souls doubted the arithmetic, but because each reduction made winter personal in a new way. A blacksmith with broad shoulders and hollow cheeks struck the church rail with his fist and demanded whether counting would heat his children. Ray answered from the posted board, voice level, finger on the date column. Counting will keep this line standing in January. Spend your anger on wood cutting. We need 14 more cords before snow closes the creek road. By the first week of November, the false calm ended with violence that did not announce itself as thunder, but as subtraction. Temperature at sunrise on November 6th stood at 11 degrees. By sunset, it had fallen to 3. At midnight, it reached 8 below zero. The wind at 2 in the morning drove hard enough to peel loose shingles from 3 south-facing roofs and collapse the canvas wall of the freight shed near the siding. Ray and Kincaid worked with 2 ranch hands in that black cold, hauling flour fragments and split bean sacks out of drift before the gusts buried them, while lanterns blew out faster than they could be relit. The freight shed failed entirely before dawn, timber folding inward under uneven snow load, and with it went 2 barrels of lamp oil and a crate of dried apples that had not yet been entered into ration stock. Nothing about the failure was dramatic to the eye once morning came. The beams simply lay down in white, as if exhaustion had reached wood itself. The storm did not pass in one day. It sat over Prairie Rose for 53 hours, then pulled east and left a crust that cut boot leather. On November 9th, the official reading at the telegraph post was 15 below at sunrise, with wind from the open prairie making exposed skin burn in less than a minute. Structures built for optimism rather than endurance began to fail in sequence. Porch pipes burst first. Then pantry walls froze through. Then stove chimneys backdrafted as wind pressure shifted, forcing smoke into rooms where families had sealed every crack with cloth. Ray moved constantly, carrying a coal shovel in one hand and a chalk stick in the other, marking doors with symbols for immediate repair, fuel shortfall, or medical watch. Nettie stayed at the church table with Eliza Dobson, updating household counts as families doubled together for warmth and single-room cabins became communal sleeping quarters. The town no longer looked like a collection of separate fortunes. It looked like one body trying to preserve core heat. Kincaid's store, once the center of Prairie Rose confidence, suffered its own public unmaking. Window boards he had nailed in September held against locusts, but trapped damp through early cold. And by mid-November, frost had formed on the inside of the plank walls in finger-thick sheets. Shelves that had carried coffee tins and sugar cones now showed empty rectangles in dust where stock had stood for years. 2 clerks left for relatives in Topeka when wages could no longer be paid in goods. Kincaid sold the brass scale from his front counter to a cattle buyer passing south, then sold his silver watch to a railroad man for less than half its spring value, taking coin and 2 sacks of coarse salt in trade. He brought both sacks straight to Ray's barn and entered them into common inventory under his own name, with no claim attached. No one laughed when he passed. By late November, the disaster widened from weather into duration. It was not one storm, but a chain of cold fronts with no full thaw between them, each one sealing the ground harder, each one shrinking options. Ray ordered interior drying lines in every shared house so damp clothes would not freeze overnight on pegs and steal body heat from sleeping children and elders. He reassigned labor crews from cellar digging to fuel salvage, splitting fence rails from abandoned corrals, and hauling cottonwood stumps from creek banks, where frost had heaved roots partly free. Daily soup kettles became 3 fixed services: dawn, midday, dusk. Each portion weighed and logged even when hands trembled on the scale. The discipline looked severe to strangers. It kept lungs working. On December the 3rd, 1874, with morning at 12 below and a steady wind that erased tracks within minutes, the first winter collapse in the road crews came. Elias Morrow, the widower teamster who had hauled limestone when others refused, was found beside his wagon in the north, cut where the road dipped toward Cottonwood Creek. He had reached the final quarter mile with a half-load of split wood for the churchyard and attempted to free a wheel frozen to rut ice after dark. His gloves were still on. The traces were still looped. The team had broken loose and returned without him before dawn. steam rising off their backs in Kincaid's lot. Ray and two men brought Elias in on a door plank to the schoolhouse, stripped his boots, packed him in warmed blankets, and worked his hands and feet by turns, while Eliza Dobson fed him salted broth a spoon at a time, once he could swallow. He lived, but lost 2 fingertips to frost and his strength for several days. Work paused for 20 minutes. Then the kettles were lit again. 2 weeks passed before the next blow, and those 2 weeks were worse for being ordinary. Cold settled around 10 below most mornings, rose only to single digits, and taught every soul in Prairie Rose the sound of hunger without complaint. On December the 19th, Reverend Amos Pike took a handcart of kindling toward the sick-room annex behind the church where 3 influenza cases had been isolated from the ration line. Snow that had lain hard all week rose suddenly in crosswind bands and turned the lane white in less than 10 minutes. Amos had preached confidence all summer and humility through autumn. In winter he hauled wood with the rest. He did not reach the annex. Ray found him by lantern near the corner fence, one hand still on the cart handle, body angled as if leaning into a door that had moved away from him. The kindling was dry. The path had vanished. They buried him on December the 21st before noon, ground open with pick and fire because shovels alone would not break the frost. Kincaid read a brief passage in a raw voice and stopped before the final line. Christmas week brought no celebration, only thinner faces and stricter entries in Nettie's careful script. Marta Kincaid, Abel's older sister, had refused line priority despite persistent coughing and had spent most of autumn in the unheated room behind the store where inventory had once been stacked. On January 2nd, 1875, she collapsed while carrying a water pail from the church pump. Ray had her moved to the warmest corner of the schoolhouse infirmary, wrapped in 2 army blankets traded months earlier for nails, and asked Ruth Morrow to sit night watch with warm broth at 2-hour intervals. Marta held through 2 nights, breathing shallow but steady, then worsened at dawn on the 3rd day when the temperature dropped to 18 below and frost rimed the inside panes again. She died before noon with Abel at her bedside, and Nettie holding the ledger closed on her lap because the page for that morning had no place for grief. Ray stood at the stove, added wood, and gave Abel time enough to bow his head before asking him to help carry broth to the noon line. Abel rose and did it. Hunger sharpened tempers after Marta's burial, and desperation pressed where pride had not yet yielded. On January 5th, a group of 6 men from the South Edge Farms came to Ray's barn after dark, coats white with drift and voices hard from 3 sleepless nights. They demanded release of the wax-sealed seed tins, arguing that seed could be eaten now and replaced later if spring proved favorable. Ray brought them below into the vault, lantern held high so they could see the shelves and the narrowed rows where abundance had once stood. Then he set 1 sealed tin on a barrelhead and explained measure by measure how many pounds would be gained today against how many acres would be lost in March, and how that loss would carry into another year of dependence that Prairie Rose might not survive. The men argued until breath smoked in the stairwell. He listened until each one finished. Then he offered an alternative: increased evening broth for their households in exchange for immediate labor on insulated pit ovens and dawnwood crews, beginning the next morning with their names first on the assignment board. No condition of apology, only work and food bound together. They accepted before leaving the barn. The help request that changed the week came just before sunrise on January 7th, when Nettie pounded on Ray's door with both fists and called through the plank that Eli Dobson's sister Annie had not taken broth since the previous night and was too weak to stand in line. Ray was dressed and moving in less than a minute, carrying a kettle hook, 2 jars of preserved carrot mash, and a packet of salt. At the Dobson house, he found Eliza on a stool by the stove, face drawn with exhaustion, trying to keep heat in a room where wind cut through two cracked boards near the sill. Annie lay bundled but awake, eyes open, lips dry. Ray did not speak of fault or delay. He set a small pot on coals, thinned mash with hot water, added salt by pinch, and fed her by spoon in measured intervals while Nettie patched the sill seam with wool scrap and clay. He marked the house for twice daily delivery and reassigned one labor credit from a stronger household without argument or public shaming. By midday, Annie sat upright against folded blankets and asked for more broth. The line outside the church moved on schedule. That evening, with wind easing for the first time in 9 days and the sky clearing to a hard iron blue above the barn roof, Ray stood at the ration table while Kincaid called names and Nettie entered weights. The numbers were lower than any previous week. The order held. When one man at the back muttered that the mole hole had become the town's last law, no one laughed, and no one objected when Ray answered, "Then let it be a just law until spring." Then let it be a just law until spring, and he turned back to the scale before any man could answer, because justice on the plains was often no larger than a quarter-pound of pork, and the refusal to look away from a ledger when hunger made every face look like kin. By the second week of January, Ray converted the barn loft into a night shelter for households whose stoves had failed beyond repair, laying straw in rows between tack hooks and hanging stitched quilts to cut drafts between family spaces, while below, the vault fed both the ration line and a new teaching bench, where he demonstrated preservation methods each afternoon by lantern. He showed how to salt thin rabbit cuts when pork was scarce, how to dry turnip slices near but not above direct heat, how to test barrel seams with candle smoke and a wetted palm, and how to bank coals in ash so a fire survived till dawn without wasting wood. Nettie stood at his right shoulder and repeated each measurement in a clear voice as if reciting arithmetic at school. Kincaid, who had once sold imported wallpaper and patent lamp ornaments at a profit, now split kindling to the finger width Ray specified and carried slop pails from the shelter without speaking unless asked a direct question. The contrast was not rhetorical. It could be counted. Over 2 years, Prairie Rose had spent more than $1,100 on porch extensions, decorative paint, and parlor goods that gave no warmth below zero. Ray's buried vault, built for $418 in stone, lime, labor, and salt, remained the one structure in town holding food at stable temperature through every hard front that winter delivered. When the church annex stove cracked on January 16th, Ray patched it with clay and scrap iron and taught 3 boys to mix refractory mud from creek sand, ash, and horsehair while they waited for broth. Those boys had painted his gate in summer. He gave them each a trowel and corrected their angle until the patch held. 3 days later, a rider from Cottonwood Creek brought delayed telegraph copies confirming what Ray had predicted in October. Rail relief would not come in meaningful volume before thaw, and the first cars would prioritize military hay and contracted freight, not settlement flour. Ray posted the notice uncut on the church door. He did not soften a word. That evening he called for a full town labor census, and by lantern they reassigned work details household by household, so no able body remained idle while fuel stacks sank. Widows took record duty in mending. Older boys hauled thaw water from broken ice. Men with injured hands, including Ray, sorted salvage grain and repaired harness. Kincaid opened his remaining storeroom and surrendered every sack, nail keg, and soap brick to communal account, then asked Nettie to inspect his entries against Ray's figures before dawn issue. On January the 24th, with sunrise at 17 below and wind knifing through the siding gaps, Eliza Dobson collapsed near the second kettle after 4 weeks of overwork and short rations. She was carried into the schoolhouse infirmary and kept there by Ruth Morrow. and by nightfall, fever had set in hard enough that Annie refused to leave her bedside. Ray sat on an upturned crate by the stove with the duty roster Eliza had balanced through the worst weeks, then reassigned her shifts by name before dawn, so the sanitation circuit would not fail while she lay still. The fever broke on January the 27th, but left her too weak to stand a full watch. She remained under blankets 2 more days, then returned on restricted duty, directing wash-water boils, bedding turns, and lye scrub rounds from a chair by the infirmary door until her strength steadied. Ray closed the ledger for 1 full minute before crossing her from medical watch to light assignment. The kettles were lit again at dusk because grief did not postpone hunger, and neither did recovery. By early February, the town had adopted Ray's methods not as emergency novelty but as discipline. Earth cellar pits appeared behind 13 houses, each measured to the same depth, vented with mesh, and whitewashed by crews rotating from dawn soup to noon repair. Smoke racks rose in the churchyard from salvaged fence posts. Families learned to grind coarse meal with less waste by dampening grain slightly before milling. Ray required each new cellar to post its inventory in chalk at the door, copied weekly into a cooperative book Nettie kept wrapped in oilcloth. Kincaid began advancing tools without charge and asking repayment only in labor hours to the common woodyard. Eliza, still pale but upright, resumed household support rounds with Annie and kept the sanitation rota in step with ration delivery, so sick rooms were not skipped when weather closed the roads. Souls who had once treated preparation as private eccentricity now debated vent angles and brine strength on church steps between services. The reckoning did not arrive as one dramatic apology. It came first in a queue of quiet visits to Ray's barn after final issue, when lamps burned low and pride could sit without audience. Caleb Dunn came on a Thursday and admitted he had urged Ray to stop digging because he feared being seen unloading stone for a mocked man. One of the ranch hands who had painted Mole Man brought a plain board and asked to replace Ray's gate at his own expense. Ruth Morrow said only that she had repeated Kincaid's phrase, "Thornton's mole hole in summer," and now wanted instruction on barrel curing for spring. Ray received each one in the same place, beside the stair to the vault, and answered with work lists rather than absolution. He assigned Caleb to train 2 younger men on cellar cribbing. He accepted the new gate board and told the ranch hand to carve measurement marks on it for school lessons. He gave Ruth a salt ratio chart copied from his mother's notebook and asked her to teach it at the first women's cooperative meeting after thaw. By the first week of March, daytime temperatures rose above freezing for 4 hours at a time, and water began running along the wagon ruts on Main Street in narrow brown threads. That thaw exposed the cost of pride in physical form. Decorative additions built in prosperity had warped, peeled, or split. 2 painted porches listed on rotten footings. A costly glass storefront installed the previous spring stood cracked from corner to sill. Ray's barn, plain and unfashioned, sat square over the vault with only minor settling at the north post, easily shimmed. Kincaid looked at the church committee and said, in full hearing, that he had sold appearances while another man built endurance, and that his pricing in June had stripped trust from hungry households before hunger arrived. No one interrupted him. Nettie recorded the statement in the cooperative minutes exactly as spoken. On March 18, 1875, the first relief wagon reached Prairie Rose with less than 1/4 of the flour promised months earlier, and no coffee at all. The driver carried 3 federal notices and 1 private letter from Newton, advising continued scarcity through planting season. Ray inspected every sack at unloading, rejected 2 for moisture spoilage, and had the good flour mixed immediately into communal stock, rather than returned to private shelves. The old order could have resumed that day, with Kincaid reclaiming control and households buying survival by cash rank. It did not. The town had crossed a line winter drew in hard weather and harder arithmetic. The formal reckoning came on April 2nd in the church after Sunday service, with snow still in fence shade and mud at the road center. There were 289 souls present by Nettie's count, standing shoulder to shoulder among pews that had hosted weddings, disputes, and harvest thanks in easier years. Kincaid rose first, not from the front but from the middle aisle, and spoke longer than any sermon he had ever praised. He repeated his own words from June, insect gossip and Thornton's molehole, then described raising flour from $4.10 to $6 per hundredweight. While warning sat in a glass jar on his counter, he stated that he had called wisdom madness and nearly buried Prairie Rose for pride and profit. He offered no plea for quick pardon. He placed on the altar rail the deed to a storage shed he still owned, to be converted into cooperative seed housing under Ray's specifications, and sat down with both hands open on his knees. Others followed in turn, not all eloquent, some barely steady. The blacksmith who had struck the rail in anger said he had mistaken force for provision. A ranch widow who had mocked the ration line said she had called restraint cruelty, and now knew restraint had kept her alive. 2 councilmen admitted they had rejected Ray's June recommendations because they feared looking alarmist before neighboring towns. Each confession contained a quote from the months of mockery, a plain account of consequence, and an offering of labor, goods or land to the cooperative structure already forming in practice. No one clapped. The room held silence like a contract. Ray did not rise until the last speaker sat. When he stood, he kept one hand on the pew back because his left hand ached in damp weather, and because steadiness was part of meaning. His voice was low enough that souls leaned forward to hear. He said his mother taught him that food kept in earth belonged first to winter, not to pride, and that preparedness without sharing became another form of hunger. He said words alone did not rebuild trust, and forgiveness without changed practice was wind across an empty field. Then he set terms that were not punishment but obligation. Every household would maintain minimum reserve by posted measure before harvest sale. Seed grain would remain under dual key, one held by the cooperative clerk and one by an elected labor captain. Price changes on staples during warnings would require public notice and council review. And each autumn, 3 training days would be held in the churchyard, where old and young learned salting, drying, cellar maintenance, and ration arithmetic. He ended with no dramatic blessing. I will teach any soul willing to measure, store, and share before the next lean year, he said. That is the only answer I have. The vote to adopt those terms was unanimous except for 3 abstentions, none opposed. Nettie, now the cooperative clerk by acclamation though barely 13, entered each article in a new ledger bound in brown calfskin, bought with pooled coin and Kincaid's remaining silver. Ray signed below her line. Kincaid signed after him. By June, families were digging with purpose where they had once mocked with ease, and a new phrase moved through Prairie Rose in feedlines and wedding suppers alike, spoken without irony and with practical respect. Build it, Thornton Deep. Prairie Rose entered January 1876 with 287 souls, a number carved by hunger and weather but not destroyed by them, and with food reserves distributed across 22 household cellars, plus the original barn vault that still anchored communal trust. The old store continued, though under cooperative pricing rules posted in plain script at the door. Kincaid kept his place behind the counter, thinner, quieter, and exact with weights. Ruth Morrow taught curing classes each autumn. Caleb Dunn managed vent inspections. Eliza Dobson remained active in sanitation and household support, training younger crews to keep infirmary standards even when workload surged. The boys who once painted insults became winter fuel captains in their 20s and corrected younger hands who treated reserve work as optional. Years later, when rail schedules stabilized and prosperity returned in cycles, Prairie Rose did not abandon the discipline earned in that winter. New houses included cellar plans and foundation drawings. Church records listed reserve totals beside baptism counts. School children copied salt ratios and drying temperatures with multiplication tables. Ray aged in work clothes, never wealthy, often consulted, his damaged hands still bracing measuring sticks over stone lines behind barns built by men who once laughed from store steps. The barn still stands over the first 12 by 18 vault. Limestone whitewash renewed by successive crews. Vent baffles replaced but never redesigned beyond Ray's original geometry because it remains sound. Above the trapdoor hangs a cedar board cut from the replacement gate and carved over years by many hands. The letters deepened each time weather softened their edges. Store low, share wide, and never mock the labor that outlives the weather. Ray stood beneath that cedar board on September 12, 1876, lantern light catching the fresh cuts where Nettie had deepened the letters with a narrow chisel, and he read the line once aloud so the 20 souls gathered in the barn could hear it as instruction rather than ornament. Then he set the first autumn lesson in motion exactly as he had promised from the church floor. "Bring the Newton slips," he said. Nettie, now taller and steadier, took 3 folded telegraph notices from an oilcloth pouch and pinned them to the wall beside the ration board. September 18th, rail congestion. November 6th, weather interruption. December 19th, freight priority unchanged. Each slip had nearly broken the town the previous year. Now each one was evidence in a school of survival. Ray made the younger men read them line by line, then calculate how many days of food each delay had cost when the town still depended on shelves and credit. Kincaid passed out chalk and did the figures with them on plank boards balanced over feed bins, his voice low, no longer selling certainty he could not guarantee. The wax-sealed seed tins were brought up next, every one accounted for. Ray called each household name, broke each seal in public, and weighed out spring allotments against the cooperative register. Not one tin had been opened in panic. Not 1 pound had vanished to private favor. When the final measure was recorded, Ray handed the emptied tins to Caleb Dunn and told him to hammer them flat for patch stock. "Nothing kept through hunger should be wasted after harvest," he said. Caleb nodded, and no one mistook the order for small talk. By late October, the first crop after the locust year stood short, but honest in the fields south of town, and Prairie Rose held 294 souls after new births and 2 families returning from relatives east. The grain was not abundant, yet it was protected before sale. 22 household cellars were inspected in 3 days, each one checked for vent mesh, whitewash condition, barrel seam, and posted inventory. Ray sent Ruth Morrow back twice to one ranch house with instructions to lower its potatoes below frost line by another 8 inches. He sent Kincaid to replace warped planks in 2 pits where spring thaw had softened the cribbing. The expensive porches from the old Pride years still leaned. The cheap limestone walls held true. The 3 councilmen who had abstained in April came last on inspection day and waited by the barn rail while others finished. They had spoken little through summer meetings, giving labor and stone but keeping their distance from the hard words of confession. At dusk, with only Ray, Nettie, and Kincaid left at the table, the oldest of them, Harlan Voss, removed his hat and put a small cloth bundle beside the ledger. It held the June 1874 jar, preserved all this time, the locust egg cluster still visible through clouded glass. "I took it from the back shelf at the store that day," Voss said. "I meant to throw it in the creek so no one would stir fear with it. I did not do it. I hid it. I did not speak of that in church. Ray looked at the jar for a long moment, then turned it so the lantern lit the gray mass within. "You will speak of it now," he said, not harshly, but with the weight of a beam being set in place. "At school this Sunday. The children must learn what dismissal looks like when it wears a respectable coat." Voss agreed. The other two abstainers followed him, each with what he had held back. One brought an unentered flour chit from Kincaid's high-priced week. The other brought a private letter from a Topeka broker, urging speculative grain release while Prairie Rose still rationed. Neither paper had altered events in the end, but both explained the silence that had hung in town meetings like smoke that would not clear. Nettie logged each document, dated, witnessed, and tied with twine, into the cooperative archive chest. No thread remained unmarked. Winter of 1876 arrived early again, though not with the same cruelty. On November the 17th, the morning read 5 degrees, and a hard wind came off the flats for 2 days. This time the soup kettles were lit before the first drift crossed Main Street. Families came by assignment, not panic. Children carried split wood to designated stacks. The infirmary opened with clean bedding already boiled and dried. Annie Dobson, stronger now, ladled broth beside Ruth Morrow, who corrected salt measure by sight and sent younger hands back when portions ran heavy. Kincaid checked weights at the scale and called out any error before it reached the line. During the second night of that cold spell, a roof beam failed in the old freight shed, ruins near the siding, where 2 drifters had bedded down without registering. One escaped with a bruised shoulder. The other, a carpenter named Joel Harker, newly arrived from Salina, was pinned at the legs beneath wet timber and could not free himself in the dark. Nettie heard the call between gusts while carrying lamp oil and ran for Ray. Ray brought 6 men, cribjacks and chain, and they worked in blowing snow by lantern and shouted count until the beam lifted clear. Harker survived, though both legs healed stiff. He stayed in Prairie Rose and built cellar doors for 8 houses the next spring, charging only for iron and taking payment in grain shares. Rescue had become practice, not spectacle. On April 4th, 1877, the church school held its first formal preparedness session, and Voss kept his word. He stood before 27 children and placed the locust egg jar on the front table beside multiplication slates. He told them where he had hidden it, why he had hidden it, and what pride had cost. No child laughed. Ray then taught them the meadowlark sign, the creekbank egg seams, the meaning of dry clicking on southwest wind, and the reason a vault between 52 and 56 degrees could feed more souls than a full shelf in August heat. They copied numbers and methods exactly. Nettie checked every page. Years moved as they do by planting and frost. Ray did not become mayor. He did not seek office. He inspected stone, corrected vents, and taught anyone willing to carry a ledger with clean hands. Kincaid kept the store under cooperative rules until 1888, then sold his share to a board elected by the grain members and worked 2 more years as weigher before rheumatism bent him from the counter. He asked once in private whether Ray had forgiven him. Ray answered the same way he had answered in church. "I have seen your change in labor and in weights. That is what keeps a town alive. Name it what you need." Kincaid wept without noise and returned the next morning to teach 2 boys how to read a scale to the ounce. Ray Thornton died on February 9, 1891 at age 56 after a short lung fever in the small room off the barn where he had kept his notebooks wrapped in oilcloth. Nettie Wainwright, then town clerk and mother of 2, sat with him through the final night and read entries back to him from the first ledger. Salt ratios, vent drafts, ration cuts, names. At dawn, she closed the book, tied the cloth, and set it in the archive chest with the telegraph slips, the flour chit, the broker letter, and the locust jar, each one cataloged and signed. Ray was buried beside his mother's copied inscription, carved on local stone. Measure first, share second, speak last. Prairie Rose in the present day still counts reserves each autumn in souls and pounds, not in boasts. The barn still stands. The vault still breathes through opposing vents. School children still file past the cedar board and trace the words with mittened fingers before first frost inspections begin. In the cooperative hall, under glass, rests a cloudy jar of locust eggs that no one threw away, because memory without proof tends to soften into story, and Prairie Rose chose instead to keep the proof, keep the method, and keep each other fed.